And we are back. We are back for another edition of Black Tower Radio. I'm your host, Jake Fox, and we are broadcasting live on 1040 AM, 92.1 FM, WYSL in Rochester, New York. Also on worldnewsradio.today. That's worldnewsradio.today. And we were joined here today by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts is an American economist, journalist, blogger, former civil servant. He reached the height of his government career when he became the United States Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy under President Reagan in 1981. In office, he and his staff successfully combated the stagflation, price inflation, and stagnation then plaguing the American economy. Roberts was a critic of the Bush and later Obama administration for handling of the war on terror, harshly criticizing the ineffectiveness, severity, and high rates of incarceration associated with the war on drugs, excessive police violence, and use of SWAT teams against civilians, and congressional approval of increased government surveillance associated with the war on terror age, which he views as a fundamental threat to the liberties enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. Welcome to the show, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you, Jake.
So, your latest article on paulcraigroberts.com, which is published today, titled, What Can Be Done? What Can Be Done by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. And it begins by saying, despite clear evidence that Washington has chosen the path to conflict with Russia and China, European governments have not objected. Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics even seem to demand more conflict or a quicker path to conflict. The European peoples themselves have not elected leadership that is willing to repudiate vassalage to Washington and conduct a rational foreign policy towards Russia. So, I mean, like you said, what can be done about this?
Well, the only thing I could come up with was that, parts of Eastern Europe are rebelling at the orders from the European Union to accept their quota of refugees from our wars in Africa and the Middle East. Hungary is refusing, and the Czech Republic, and some of the other countries that were long part of the Soviet bloc. They are saying, well, we didn't join the EU in order to be overrun by people that aren't us, They don't really fit in with our culture and way of life. And so the EU is suing them to force them to accept the debris, the human debris from our wars in the Middle East. In other words, Washington is operating through the EU to use these countries as a dumping ground for all the millions of Muslims that Washington has dislocated and dispossessed, whose cities and towns and villages are in rubble and infrastructure destroyed. And so one can have a lot of sympathy for these people. One can also see it from the standpoint of the Eastern Europeans. And so what the hope is that these Eastern European countries, or those that are still able to think, would break off from the EU and NATO and form a neutral buffer between Western Europe and Russia. And this would then get all of the forward U.S. and NATO bases off of Russia's borders. And I think that would lead to a great deal of defusing of an extremely dangerous situation. And if the Czech Republic and Hungary and some of the others did this, it might have an impact on the British and the French and the Germans, because they don't have anything to gain from being pushed by Washington into conflict with Russia. I mean, they would instantly be wiped out, for all time. And so it's really quite stupid of these governments to accept the high level of tension that Washington has created with the Russians. So that's about all that I could see that could be done, because Washington, I think, misreads Russian responses. When Washington does something provocative, instead of reacting strongly, the Russians keep their cool and react diplomatically and offer to work things out in an agreement. And I think Washington is mistakenly reading that as fear or weakness rather than common sense. And so Washington then pushes harder. Well, there are limits beyond which you can't push the Russians. They're not some little country we can go invade and bomb into the Stone Age. I mean, they can blow us off the face of the earth every bit as easily as we can do that to them. So to have that type of tension is it's really criminally insane for Washington to be provoking the Russians and now the Chinese in this way. So Eastern Europe could perhaps see that they've got nothing to gain in this. They've got nothing to gain from being a member of NATO and nothing to gain from being a member of the EU, and should just withdraw, form a neutral buffer. And I think that would do a great deal to reduce the dangerous situation.
Well, it seems like not only Eastern Europe is rebuffing Washington, but it also seems like the German people are rebuffing Washington as well, as Merkel just lost nearly 10% of her support. She went from 41% in the previous election to 33% in the most recent election, and a right-wing populist party emerged and now holds seats in their parliament and gained 12.6% of the vote. I mean, it's not hard to see where her support fell and went to. How do you think this new dynamic plays into German politics and how it affects the American agenda?
Well, first of all, it's not clear that this new party is right-wing. It's branded right-wing because it's against the million or 2 million, whatever the number was, of Muslim refugees from our wars in the Middle East that Merkel accepted into Germany. In other words, Merkel said, okay, we'll be the dumping ground for all the people you Americans have dislocated in Africa and the Middle East with all your wars. I mean, we've been attacking, it's 7 or 8 countries in the last 16 years, and we've destroyed and hauled apart 7 countries, and these huge numbers of people are fleeing. There's no, we've made their homeland a wasteland, and so where they're going to go. So we gave orders to the EU, and they gave them to Germany, and Merkel, being a good American puppet, they took them all in. Well, it's been hell for Germany. There's been all kinds of rapes and crimes and huge numbers of people saddled on local governments to support and all that sort of stuff. And the Germans have turned on Merkel for that reason. I don't think they connected to our policies toward Russia. So even though the heavy dose of refugees is not good for the Germans, it's nothing like a nuclear war. So it's possible now that there's an alternative party, plus there are now two, because Merkel's decline in the last election also cost her coalition partner. So the second largest partner has refused to participate with Merkel's party in a coalition, so they also are in opposition. So you've now got the second and third largest parties in opposition to the coalition that Merkel will put together. And it's entirely possible that now there will be real debate in the whole question of all of this conflict that's being engineered with Russia may become part of the German debate. And once that gets in the public's mind, they will realize they've got nothing to gain from being, the forward base for America's aggression against Russia. So it could work out that European voices will start being raised because they'll be the first to go, and that this somehow will cause the American neoconservatives and the Israel lobby and the military security complex to back off this sort of dangerous warmongering that they orchestrate. So we'll have to wait and see if that happens.
And this next article titled Washington, this was published on September 25th, Washington has initiated military conflict with Russia. In the first link here, it says Russia has provided evidence that Washington is collaborating with ISIS in attacks on Russian forces. This is an article from Russian Insider where Russia presents satellite proof U.S. troops is collaborating with ISIS in Syria. Can you go a bit deeper into that, Dr. Roberts? I'm sorry.
This is a news report, and I suspect it is true because there are other ways of knowing this is true, not just from the satellite photographs that show our troops and our equipment operating in ISIS areas without any threat from ISIS. In fact, everyone seems to have forgotten that General Flynn, who was forced out by the military security complex from Trump's government as National Security Advisor. General Flynn was the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And he said on television, it's still available on YouTube, he said on TV that the decision to send ISIS to Syria was a willful decision of the Obama administration made over General Flynn's recommendation. He recommended not doing that. They overruled him and sent ISIS there. So the Russians themselves have increasingly said that the Americans are not fighting ISIS. They're pretending to fight ISIS while they are interjecting their own forces and their own weapon systems into the part of Syria that still hasn't been retaken by the Syrians and the Russians in an effort to divide the country and hold on to part of it in order to keep the conflict going forever. So it is true that ISIS is a United States creation, just like bin Laden was. You know, everyone's already forgotten that we created bin Laden and al-Qaeda to go fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. And we created ISIS to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya. And when the British Parliament and the Russian government blocked Obama from invading Syria, General Flynn said that Obama and Hillary, who was Secretary of State, sent ISIS to Syria to do the job for them. And probably would have succeeded, except the Russians intervened. So there is this collusion. As far as I can tell, any of the so-called major terrorist groups that we hear about all the time, these are basically American creations that we created to serve our purpose. Now, sometimes they get out of control and go on their own way and aren't serving our purpose, but the origin seems to be CIA.
Where do you think Trump is in all of this? Do you think he has any sort of control over this situation?
No, I don't think he does. Trump, you see, all of Trump's troubles came because he said he was going to defuse the tensions with Russia. He was going to normalize relations with Russia. Well, and of course that's what people want. We don't want the Cold War all over again, this time much more dangerous. But when he said that, he was making, whether he understood it or not, a massive threat to the most powerful part of American government, the military security complex. The budget of the military security complex is $1 trillion a year, $1,000 billion. You see, it's not just the Pentagon. You know, what the Pentagon's budget is something like $700 billion. But it's all of the 17 intelligence agencies that have to be added to that, and the Department of Energy, because the Department of Energy is where the nuclear weapons programs are. The Energy Department has control over the uranium and nuclear energy and that sort of stuff. So when you add all that up, and in various off-budget items, it's $1 trillion. Well, that's a huge amount of money and power. And it needs an enemy. If it doesn't have an enemy, what is the justification for it? And it also needs wars. Because if you're producing all of these weapons, tanks and jet fighters, what happens when you get enough of them? Why do you need to do more? And so you have to use them up. And so the 16 years of wars in the Middle East and Africa have helped use up this stuff. And so Pentagon comes and says, oh, we got to have these tanks. All these tanks are blown up, and these Humvees are blown up, and these fighter jets crashed, and this and that. And so they always have to have, and all these missiles we've used, all these Hellfire missiles and drones, and the stockpiles are low, and that's how they keep it all going. Otherwise, we would just have warehouses full of this stuff everywhere. Like, remember decades ago, we had these great grain silos everywhere full of rotting grain from the farm subsidies. Well, that's what the military budget is. It's a subsidy to the armaments companies. And they make all this stuff, and so, well, we have to go use it up. And so between that, having to, have a reason to replace weapons, you have to have an enemy. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we didn't have one. And so the military security complex didn't know what to do. They first said, well, look, we got to rebuild. Vietnam took a toll on our stuff, and we've got to modernize and rebuild, and then you can reduce the budget. Well, Of course, Congress isn't ever going to cut it because of all the campaign contributions. But during that time that they were granted to rebuild and all, they created the Muslim threat, the terror threat, the war on terror. So they had an enemy. But it's not a big enough enemy. You know, the terrorists don't have air forces and navies and nuclear missiles and all this stuff. And so they had to recreate the Russian threat. And it works because Americans all remember the Soviet threat in the Cold War, and most Americans never differentiated between the Russians and the Soviets. It was just a name change. And so it's worked. And so we now have all these generals telling us every day that our greatest threat is Russia. Well, of course, Russia has never said anything threatening. They're not doing anything threatening, but they keep repeating it so people hear it and hear it. Oh, they're a threat. They're a threat. And it works. And so when you make a threat out of a non-threat, it makes the non-threat wonder what's going on. Plus, there's another difference, Jake. During the Cold War, we did not have the neoconservatives running our foreign policy. The Americans did not have an ideology of world hegemony. We didn't declare ourselves to be the exceptional, indispensable people. We didn't say we had we're the sole power, the unipower. We didn't make any of these claims. Every American president did everything they could to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union. We had all these arms agreements and all kinds of other agreements and all kinds of cooperation, and everybody was working to be sure that nobody with nuclear missiles ever made a misunderstanding about the intentions of the other. Well, now all that's gone. We're making constant accusations against the Russians, and they know are false. They say, look, when they make these false accusations against a country, what happens next? They invade. Remember all the false accusations against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Remember Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. We knew damn good and well he didn't have any such weapons. All the stuff about Assad's use of chemical weapons is all a lie. All the lies about the Gaddafi in Libya. And so the Russians have watched us set countries up for attack by spreading lies about them. And so now they say, well, now it's us they're spreading lies about. So the only safe conclusion is they're going to attack us. Well, you got to see how dangerous this is. I mean, the Russians can, their nuclear forces are actually more modern, more dangerous than ours. And to be confusing them about our intentions, in fact, maybe we aren't confusing them. Maybe we do intend to attack them. But it was about a month ago where the Operation Command of the Russian High Command announced publicly that they were completely convinced that the United States was preparing a surprise nuclear attack on Russia. Well, this should have had the American president on the phone instantly to Putin saying, oh, no, we have no such intentions. We're not going to do anything like that. There wasn't a peep said. We didn't give any reassurance. Nobody in Europe said, what the hell is this? Nobody said anything. So the Russians didn't even get any kind of reassurances when the head of the Operation Command makes a public statement like that. So Americans are just completely out to lunch. They've got no idea of the situation. Anyone who can't see how dangerous this is a complete lunatic. I mean, and nobody even talks about, I don't think the news even reported this public statement by the head of Operation Command in Russia. So, you know, I think we're just living day to day. And, you know, and Trump, what's happened to Trump? Okay, he was going to normalize relations with Russia, and they said that's why all this attack on him about Russian interference with elections. They forced him off of that completely, so now he's a warmonger. He learned that the only thing he can do and remain president is to be a warmonger. So we're going to destroy North Korea. We're going to destroy Iran. Everything he was going to do to reduce tensions with Russia is completely off the table. So yeah, we've got a lunatic in the Oval Office who saw he was a captive. They were going to get rid of him. That's what the whole purpose of the special prosecutor, the former FBI director Mueller, looking into Trump as a Russian agent. That investigation is still going on. And that's telling Trump, if you don't get in bed with us, we're getting rid of you. And so he's learned the lesson, and there's nobody in the government that supports him. He got rid of General Flynn. He got rid of Bannon. He got rid of his press guy. Everybody who was in any way aligned with Trump in reducing tensions with Russia and in bringing the jobs home from Asia, they're gone. And we've got the same old crowd, the Zionists who want Iran gone because the paranoid Israelis think that Iran's a threat to them, so they want us to go to war with Iran. We've got the corporate people who are saying we want the jobs overseas, the labor's cheaper, we don't care about the American workforce, we only care about our profits for our shareholders and our bonuses. You've got the military security complex saying we're not giving up a $1 trillion budget and all the huge profits that it brings us and the influence and the ability to buy the elections. And so what could Trump do? Did nothing.
Later in this article you say, sooner or later it will dawn on the Russian government that Washington is not a rational government with which diplomacy can be practiced, peace pursued, and agreements reached. Sooner or later it will dawn on the Russian government that far from being rational, Washington is a criminally insane collection of psychopaths in thrall to the military security complex, which, in turn, is in thrall to its massive profits. So when Russia realizes this, if they realize this, what are the possibilities from there?
Well, they've already realized it, but I'm just trying to make people think. The people did not get any reporting from the American media when the Operation Command made that public statement that I just told you about. So they don't know that the Russians have already realized it. So I'm just trying to make them think about what the consequences are of constantly provoking and accusing somebody who can kick your ass. And that's what we're doing. And I think that it's going to get worse because think about this NFL stuff, all right? The black players don't kneel, don't stand for the national anthem. So everybody, all the Americans have gone berserk. Playing the flag card always works. Everybody's patriotism goes into hyper mode, and we're going to take away the NFL players' First Amendment rights because it's unpatriotic for them to protest. Well, all this patriotism that's being whipped up against the NFL players, this is going to be turned against Russia. That's what's going to happen. It's all this hyper patriotism, wearing the flag on your sleeve and yelling at everybody. And this now plays directly into the hands of the military security complex, directly into the hands of the neoconservatives, directly into the Israel lobby's hands. The Israel lobby is desperate to have us at war with Iran. The Russians aren't going to tolerate a war against Iran. That's on their border. Americans are they're not educated. They don't pay attention. They're only interested in their golf scores, football scores, the wife's remodeling the kitchen, or their operations, or their gadgets. They've got really no grasp on what's happening. And they can't get it from the media. And, you know, there are only a few of us who can speak out. If you work somewhere, you can't speak out. You get fired. And so this is the situation. It's very, very dangerous. It's what I've said. It's what I'm trying to emphasize.
And yeah, you can't really emphasize how dire the situation is enough. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to speak with us. I urge everyone to go to paulcraigroberts.com, support, donate.
.org.
Yeah, I'm sorry, .org, paulcraigroberts.org, support, donate. You know, this is a public service he provides for everybody, and you know, he's a rare truth teller out there, and he needs everybody's support. Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for coming on the show today.
Okay, Jake, and thanks for sharing your audience, and thanks for the work you do.
Thank you.
So long.
So that was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts dropping some knowledge for you. And we will be right back with Barry Eisler, former clandestine CIA agent and author. We're going to discuss some geopolitics. So we will be right back with Barry Eisler, former CIA agent and author. Stay tuned.